What does life hold for philosophy majors? I decided to find out. Welcome to Life After Philosophy. I'm Christopher Anadale. Welcome back to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Father Chad Arnold.
Hello.
He is the Vocation Director and Director of Seminarians and of the St. Joseph House of Formation for the Catholic Diocese of Wichita, Kansas. He completed his philosophy education with a BA in philosophy at Conception Seminary College in Missouri in 2006. He was ordained a Catholic priest in 2010 and holds a Master of Divinity degree from Mount St. Mary's Seminary. Father Chad, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
It's good to see you again after all these years.
Yeah.
You were a student of mine back at Conception back in the day.
Right.
And I should mention also, Father Chad is the host of a podcast called About 4 O'Clock, talking about
just discernment and vocation.
Discernment and vocation
me and
issues.
Two other priests of the diocese.
Very good. Well worth looking up
Thank you.
Subscribing to. I wanted to ask you about how your philosophy education has affected the kind of work you do now. And maybe I should say, for the sake of people who don't know Catholic priesthood or seminary formation, that the vocation director is something like a personnel officer in charge of, we might say, recruitment and retention in a way,
that's
for
fair.
men in the early stages of priestly discernment and formation. If you want to say any more about the job, but then I'm interested specifically about how has studying philosophy 20 years ago affected the way that you do the job now?
Well, it's kind of funny to me when I was trying to think about how does my philosophy degree affect me. I was interested in philosophy before I started working towards the degree, but I only started working towards the degree because it was required towards the priesthood. And now I oversee, within the house that I live in are about 30 guys who are also all working towards a philosophy degree as well, and so I oversee them. I don't know that I consciously think about my philosophy degree, and I don't know if that's the same with people with all degrees or not, but I think of it more like a foundation. I mean, it certainly formed me in how I see the world, in the analytical approaches I go, how I work through a problem. And so it's almost, this may be too hyperbolic, but it's an intellectual type of breathing for me. It's nothing that I consciously invoke, that I don't really, talk about Kant or Nietzsche or anyone in that with any regularity.
Right.
But the systems and the way to look at the world and in invoking of logic and looking for consistency and working through things exists within me and is a regular part of my work as I work with young men as they discern the possibility of call to priesthood, looking for how they view the world and are there logical fallacies, are there lies, are there mistakes, are there inconsistencies in their thought, and trying to help them to see in greater clarity. As all the men I work with, we look to serve God, who is a God of source of truth, and so we want that consistency and that orientation towards reality and truth in there. So in that way, I invoke it a lot. In the pragmatic sense, because I live with 30 college-age guys that are all studying philosophy, we have regularly the dumbest philosophy questions around the breakfast table. Everyone's a budding philosopher in the house, which is both endearing and obnoxious at the same time.
I have never really considered the possibilities. Wow.
Is water wet is a yearly discussion, seems like, and all other sorts of. Just the other night, they were having a debate about the philosophical principles of the movie Tangled. That was a conversation I just decided to walk away from because I just didn't have the energy at 8 o'clock at night for that one.
Wow. And of course, you have to do it over again every couple of years with a new crop of guys. So it's a bit like being a teacher.
It is. It is.
Same material and the same sort of developmental stage for everybody.
And it's fun to watch with the guys like me, they're all looking at the possibility of priesthood. And so they are required to work towards their degree in philosophy. And some of them approach it with great eagerness, and some of them approach it with a great dread. And sometimes those focus shift through the year, and sometimes for the entire 4 years, they maintain that dread or that eagerness. But it is funny when they get that first taste of philosophical reasoning and things just open up for them, and their enthusiasm and their overabundance of confidence in those moments is it's fun.
Right. Well, whether a man is called to the priesthood, whether he's successful in sort of seeing that through to becoming a priest, doesn't depend directly on how good a philosopher he is, but he's doing. There's some philosophical element involved in this discernment that men are doing. Is that something that you've come to observe, that in addition to sort of taking classes in philosophy, the men are sort of turning their philosophical eye upon themselves and their view of the world and their place in it?
I think to greater or lesser degrees, yes. I think on the lesser end of it, I don't see them so much turning their philosophical knowledge inward on themselves, but it does adjust their burgeoning worldview, and that in turn, whether they're talking about of a political nature, family of origins, or life goals, that philosophical training trains that, and then that shifts into their discernment. But I've also seen guys on the very steeper end of their anthropology class really changes, and they really go deep into themselves and their understanding of their own person and being, and see that philosophy is a direct link to their discernment of where God is calling them to. So I see them run the entire spectrum.
No, that's great. That's great. Some people might suppose that psychology, or maybe just sort of theology or spirituality, pastoral care, would be the more appropriate discipline or framework with which to approach, just helping men to sort out, and helping, of course, the bishop and the higher-ups in the church to sort out which men are called and whether they're called to serve God in the priesthood. What's your thinking about that? Does philosophy have a sort of priority over other disciplines, or is it simply more? Is it more fundamental or earlier in the process? Where do you see that mapping out?
I think we were always given the classic adage that philosophy is the handmaid of theology, and so if you're ever going to understand God in his infinite complexities, if you can't string a linear thought together, you're not going to make it very far in theology, and so. It's a stepping stone to that greater understanding of God and theology to work there. I also would say, particularly in our day and age right now, I believe that culturally we struggle with logical consistency, and it's very hard to arrive at truth and understanding of self, or to direct the emotions in an appropriate way if you have no consistency in that. And so I think philosophy gives them kind of that framework to bring those other things of psychology and theology in place. We live in a world that is enthralled by shortcuts, and I think philosophy makes us take the long way, which, as we get used to that pattern, will help us in the spiritual and the psychological way as well. Just that frame that there really aren't shortcuts in any of those fields.
Have you found some men have their discernment come into sharp focus because of philosophy? You mentioned their anthropology as well, but is there a way in which somebody, has it ever happened, somebody has said, in light of something philosophical that I've learned or done, I've reached a greater degree of certainty about the call, either that I have it or that I don't have it? And perhaps it's the wrong sort of question.
Yeah, I don't know if I've heard it expressed that specifically or that directly. I have had, I can think of one man who, prior to coming into seminary, was already studying philosophy and had designated himself a Stoic. And as he kind of got into a deeper philosophy and a more, I would say, Christian-imbued philosophy, he began to move away from that Stoicism, which actually allowed him to open up to more some of the things that were going on in family and interpersonally, which then specifically aided his discernment. So I don't know if he he would have said philosophy did this, but he certainly had to make a very specific philosophical journey along that way that is still ongoing, but I've seen progress over the years.
I would imagine that's different for every man. And one of the things that I sometimes will have to tell people who don't know much about seminary philosophy is that it's not all Thomism, and it's not all the sort of path towards a deeper systematic Thomism. Is there sort of curiosity about Thomism among the men that you work with, or do you think that it has a sort of a place among other elements in the philosophy education they pursue?
In our particular program, our principal philosophical teacher is a very strong Thomist. So I think they certainly look at different veins of philosophy, but that is definitely the path that our men are the most steeped in. And so I don't know that they have. I think Dr. Brungart does a pretty thorough job of answering their questions in those realms.
That's fantastic. That's good. Do you work with the Propaedeutic Year at all? The new sort of pre-seminary year, or year zero of seminary.
Yeah.
I was wondering what your experiences with that have been like, and especially maybe whether you, as a man with a little bit of sort of, maybe I say, philosophical antenna, to sort of think about how is this man understanding himself and his place in the world, his relation to God. Has that been useful at all in thinking about setting up this new year of discernment?
It's interesting. We're in in our second year. To be frank, I don't love it that philosophy is not a part of the Propaedeutic Year. The goal in removing it was to allow the men more time for some of the spiritual and human components, and I think that's a good goal. And I think some of the men, the Propaedeutic, they come from such a wide range. It would be hard to find something that hits all of the guys. So there's a few people in our Propaedeutic program that really needed that extra space and time to develop those other things. However, just from an academic sense, removing any philosophy, if a man comes in and he's got a Propaedeutic year in 2 years, it really kind of forces a condensing of the philosophy in those 2 years, which I don't love. And many of the guys are hungry, and gen eds and language studies, whereas important, are good, leave them with more free time than I would prefer. And seminary, by its nature, has lots of time for thought and introspection. And when that thought is less guided, it's not as helpful for an 18, 19, 20-year. And they have spiritual directors, they have formation, right? So it's not like they're left to the wolves. But I would actually have like a little bit more, to maybe a step back, but not a complete. In fact, we're looking at some other programs who make an argument for at least logic being more thought of as a gen ed than as strictly a quote unquote philosophy class, and by that way can add that into the Propaedeutic Year. So we're exploring that possibility as well. So yeah, and the guys being guys, it's a running joke in the house that the older guys will talk about philosophy and look at one of the Propaedeutic and say, well, you can't talk about this. You're not allowed to talk about philosophy. So they just shut them down, and it becomes a joke. In the beginning, I think some of the young guys are actually pretty annoyed by it, because it is a paternalistic dismissive and meant in jest, but it's a young man who's trying to prove himself gets a little hairs come up on his neck a little bit on that. Sure,
no, I understand. The most I could hope for might be that there is a kind of implicit philosophy of life that you absorb through the special discipline and the separation from the world that seems to go along with the Propaedeutic Year, at least as I've understood it, the way we do it here.
I think, and here, as I understand it, a lot of time you are dealing with guys that have either their college degree or some work experience. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. We are a little bit of an anomaly in the United States in Wichita, in that most of our men are college age or out of high school. And so, we have 30 guys in there, about a third of them are Propaedeutic guys. And, the oldest one in that is, 21. So most of them are pretty young. And so it's not a reintroduction into study for them. They're coming out of study programs, and so just shifting. It's more like shifting a degree than a full change of life. And most of them are coming from, thankfully, fairly virtuous, fairly disciplined. Our guys, the majority of them are experienced with liturgy hours and are experienced with regular prayer, and so they tend to. That's why I am less worried about them starting philosophy. But it's a little bit unique to us. For sure.
That does sound different. I mean, my understanding is that that is very atypical. That the teenage seminarian is much more rare these years than the man who's maybe in his 20s or 30s or even 40s and has been in the world for a dozen years or more.
Yeah.
With a career, and that does require perhaps more of a transition time period to move into classroom study and then daily prayer and communal living, all the things that you might have felt you got away from when in your 20s, especially. Part of every seminary curriculum is first, now there's Propaedeutic Year, 2 years of philosophy study, if a man doesn't already have a degree, and then 4 years of theology study, perhaps some time also in the transitional diaconate. But it looks like it's, for most people, anywhere between a 4 and a 7 year journey between sort of first discernment and, if it's successful and approved at every stage, ordination. And so philosophy at most is part of those first couple of years. Formal study, presumably it sets the foundation for much of what comes afterwards. But I've been curious, I'd love to know your opinion of this as a priest and as a brother to your brother priests out in Wichita. Is there a way in which every priest is a philosopher? Does he carry that identity with him into his ministry, or does it serve more as a kind of formative thing that remains in the past and maybe at a low level?
Well, I would definitely, I think, go more with the former, in the sense, I had a professor tell me at one point in time, it may have been you, I don't know. Age has made me forget who gave me this wisdom, but I pass it on to the guys all the time. But every person is doing philosophy, just many people are doing it badly. You can't live without living by a philosophy, whether you are conscious of it or not. And so in that sense, every priest is formed in an intentional philosophy of life. And I would say most of the priests, not all priests, but you have a predilection towards, long form study and understanding of things. And I think that comes from this philosophical mindset that's imbued with them from early on. So, it would be the minority of priests that I know that are actually reading strictly philosophical texts and having open philosophical discussion. There's a few of them,
sure,
but they would be the minority. But all of us are living philosophy and in I think intentional ways.
That's great. That's fantastic. What about the philosophy among the laity that whom you know of? A few people I've spoken with before on this podcast have talked about reading groups that have sprung up, sort of that either that they've helped organize or that have come up in parishes that they've been associated with. Enough that I've been surprised to hear the story maybe 2 or 3 times that people we got together started reading through parts of the Summa, or everybody brings a work, maybe something accessible by Joseph Pieper or some other interesting Catholic philosopher, to a men's group to talk about. Has there been any of that you're aware of, and do you suppose that might be a kind of bridge or common interest between clergy and laity?
Yeah, I think so. I hadn't thought about it along those lines, but I certainly know of a number of reading groups that have expanded. I think it's National Well-Read Moms, I think it's called, has become a popular thing that I know a lot of women in our diocese are involved in. It's more focused on classical works, but there's a variety of things in it. And Joseph Pieper seems to keep coming up in lots of different places. So I feel, at least in some of the groups that I know, Jordan Peterson has also inflamed a lot of people's curiosity and got them reading in areas they had not previously given much thought to.
That's interesting.
And I think it comes down to, again, that there's a natural hunger if a person has an inquisitive mind, because we all live philosophy, and so much of our cultural diet right now is a reductionist sort of thing, that it's like eating Hostess cakes all the time. At some point, you're like, I need something substantial to be healthy. And I think that, in intellectual life, that's coming out in these reading groups and these discussions, or even I see, people see various things on the internet, and they can sense it's wrong, but they can't articulate why. And I think that also drives them to read more, or to look into more philosophical text, to be able to define the answer why I know this to be wrong, but I can't say why.
That's great. That's great. Do you suppose that there is something like maybe a kind of general Catholic philosophy of life, or sort of loose group of philosophies that would be called Catholic in character, that might be or become distinctive of the Catholic Church's kind of public face in the U.S., whether in Wichita or in other parts of the country? Or generally, would people begin to think, they're Catholics, they think in this way, which has a certain philosophical valence to it, rather than, they go to this church, to this building, they worship in this way, but they think, they see themselves, they see humanity, etc., in this way. What do you suppose?
I think so. At least that's not hard for me to imagine. I'm a proponent that history repeats itself, and I think we have multiple examples of it in history where the predominant culture has kind of intellectually drifted from where Catholicism comes from, and Catholicism continues to draw from a lot of the historically same sources, and that there becomes more and more a Catholic way of thought, and those things part for a while, and then eventually they seem to come back together, or rather, again, maybe you could call me a triumphalist, but the secular mode drifts out, and historically, I would say often or not, destroys itself or crumbles in on itself, and then as the church has lasted over the 2,000 years, it's left standing with its own philosophical rigor and tradition, and as the other piece kind of falls apart, there's a drift back towards that, because there's stability there is growth, and there is safety in that, which ideally truth in a virtuous society should provide us those things.
Absolutely. That's great. That's a good answer. I'm hopeful on that score, but I don't know what the future holds, of course.
Me neither.
Two more things I wanted to do. One, it just occurred to me, I did not mention in the introduction probably the most memorable Chad Arnold story in my mind, which is the story of the rickshaw. The time you built a rickshaw at Conception and pulled Brian Casillas at least partway around Lake Placid.
About a mile and a half.
And we joked that he would come carrying you back, over his shoulder.
It got pretty close to that. I was not in as good of shape as I had been at previous states in my life. It was a bit rough.
Yeah. That's a wonderful story. My kids, I'm sure, remember that as well. So we're old enough at the time. So the other thing I wanted to do is just ask you the final question of the show, which is, what kind of advice would you have for either current students of philosophy, potential students of philosophy, or, given that you're a vocation director, men who are maybe examining in their own hearts maybe the beginnings of a glimmer of a call, what might be a call to the priesthood? What kind of advice can you give you from your perspective in life to people who are thinking, what is this something that I pursue further? Is it worth the risk? Is it the kind of thing that deserves my attention?
I would, and I don't know the audience for this particular podcast, but sometimes when I talk with guys about further study of philosophy, I think it's good, and I think it's valuable. Not all philosophers are created equal, and so one must be careful if one is to pursue it,
right,
that it is a healthy branch of philosophy. In classic Christian discernment, you'll know a tree by its fruit, and so to pay attention to who are the other students here, and is their life lived out something that actually looks like something I would desire, or at least has resonance with what I want to do. And if not, then don't just say, well, this is philosophy, I need to study this. Nope, back away from that, because there can be poor philosophers out there living problematic decision. I think Fulton Sheen says, you will either live what you believe or you will end up believing what you live.
Very good. Very Sheen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you got to pay attention to the source. But that certainly there is value in it, and then it can be a pathway to assist in discernment if one is looking at a vocation. After all, from a Christian ethos, if philosophy is meant to lead us towards truth and reality, God is the source of truth and reality. So well done philosophy should lead us to God.
Excellent. That's fantastic. That's a good way to put it. And I think we'll wrap up at that point. My guest today has been Father Chad Arnold of the Catholic Diocese of Wichita, Kansas, where he's the vocation director, the director of seminarians, and of the St. Joseph House of Formation, and my former student from Conception Seminary College. Father Chad, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.